One of the most requested topics for a video I've seen for this channel is to rank different ways to reduce your carbon footprint. Essentially, this tells me two things. The first is that British Petroleum succeeded beyond doubt with its advertising campaign in 2004 to create the idea of a carbon footprint, shifting the blame for climate change from corporations to individuals. That's right, it's your fault the Earth is warming. If you didn't consume as much fossil fuel in a society where coal, oil, and gas are ubiquitous in everyday life, we wouldn't be in this mess. Maybe next time you'll think twice before driving to work, eating a steak, or God forbid, thinking about vacationing. Oh no! After all, who cares more about sustainability than big oil? Oh yeah, and the second thing it tells me is that you'll want a tier list video, so let's get right into it. So the ideas we're going to rank are all common day suggestions you've probably heard for reducing your personal carbon emissions, including the age-old debate of paper versus plastic straws. Even though we've established that corporations and governments are the reason we're in this mess, it doesn't mean that you can't make small changes in your daily life to produce less carbon, while also keeping money in your pocket that would otherwise support companies like ExxonMobil. The way we will be ranking these ideas is based on how much CO2 equivalent, or CO2e, is mitigated by making the change. CO2 equivalent just means the amount of warming that all the greenhouse gases involved in the action would cause. For example, burning natural gas makes CO2, but it also leads to methane emissions coming from leaky pipes and drills. This methane warms the planet on top of the CO2 made when it's burned, meaning the CO2 equivalent of burning methane is higher than just the CO2. Essentially, CO2e covers all our warming bases and is a more accurate way to think about warming. But anyway, let's get into this tier list, shall we? So our first idea on the list is to eat less meat. Whether this means going vegetarian, vegan, or just trying out meatless Mondays, people often claim that reducing your demand for meat has a huge impact on carbon emissions. And they're right. Beef is objectively the worst food for the climate due to CO2e coming from deforestation for pastures, transportation, and bovine belches rich with methane. 1 kilogram of beef on average produces about 83 kilograms of CO2e. That's the equivalent of taking a block of dry ice the same weight as a large man and letting it all go into the atmosphere, just for 1 kilogram of beef. Doing a quick back of the envelope calculation, if you eat 100 grams of beef once per day, this comes out to 3,027 kilograms of CO2e per year, over 3 metric tons, just from your beef. Cutting this from your diet yields incredible results, so I'm placing it in S tier right off the bat. But what about other meats? The CO2e coming from pork is nowhere near as bad as beef, but still comes out to around 449 kilograms of CO2e per year for 100 gram daily servings. Avoiding pork would cut almost half a ton from your personal emissions, so I'll put it squarely in B tier. Chicken comes in third place for our meats at around 360 kilograms of CO2e for 1 year of 100 gram daily servings. A chickenless diet still mitigates a decent amount of CO2e, so I'm going to put it right next to pork in B tier. While I could go on to list every food in the grocery store, I'm sure this would bore the crap out of you, so if you want to learn more, I've linked a graphic in the description with about 30 different foods and their CO2e. While we're on the topic of food, another idea I hear thrown around a lot is to reduce your food waste. But how does this keep CO2 out of the air? Well, a lot of CO2 went into growing and shipping your food, so throwing it in the trash is the climate equivalent of just burning a pile of coal in the parking lot for the hell of it. Plus, when it rots in a landfill, it produces methane, making it a double whammy for the planet. On average, the CO2e from food waste comes out to about 500 kilograms of CO2e per person per year. Realistically, any one of us could cut this down by as much as 50% by only buying what you need at the grocery store, storing leftovers more efficiently, and making fewer mistakes in the kitchen.
It's black!
This would mean about 250 kilograms of CO2e kept out of the atmosphere, putting this idea squarely in B tier. Not hard to pull off and pretty effective at the same time. The last idea to do with food is to eat local produce. People claim that by eating locally, the amount of CO2 coming from transportation is vastly reduced compared to eating beef shipped across the ocean. However, this is more marketing than anything. The average percentage of emissions coming from food transportation makes up less than 10% of the total emissions. For proteins like beef, transportation accounts for less than 0.5% of the total CO2e. The majority of food emissions come from deforestation, soil degradation, fertilizers, machinery, and methane. By and large, locally grown produce follows all these same methods while occasionally making these issues worse from lower efficiency. This equates to negligible reductions in CO2e and potentially an increase depending on the product, placing this idea squarely in F tier. Surprisingly, this is not a slant against local produce. It is incredibly important for community autonomy, public health, and economic development. If anything, this highlights the underlying problems of agriculture as a whole, showing how skewed the current system is to massive agro-capitalists who overexploit farmland and increasingly strip soils of nutrients to then be replaced by climate-warming synthetic fertilizers. If locally sourced food is to be a part of decarbonization, there will need to be top-down changes in the way we run our farms. Alright, that's enough about food. What about our outfits? Is there a way we can still dress like sexy idiots without ruining the climate? Well, one idea that keeps coming up is to step away from fast fashion. But how much do cheap clothes actually hurt the climate? Isn't it just like cotton? Well, it turns out that growing cotton requires a lot of water, pesticides, and fertilizers, just like any other crop, meaning it's pretty carbon intensive. Also, polyester just comes straight from petroleum, so that soft, cozy pair of pajama pants you've had since last Christmas were probably subterranean sludge the year before. As an average for how much CO2e clothes produce, I have used a pair of denim jeans as a baseline estimate. Not as much as a winter coat, but more than a tank top, a nice middle-of-the-road item that clocks in at 33.4 kilograms of CO2e for one pair. The average American bought 68 articles of clothing last year and 8 pairs of shoes, with the average shoe emitting around 14 kilograms of CO2e per pair. That means, using our jeans and shoe estimates, the average American produced 2,383 kilograms of CO2e just from their shopping habits. If we cut our average in half, we could each stand to keep nearly 1,200 kilograms of CO2 out of the air. Not to mention reducing demand for sweats made in sweatshops and factories that dump dyes into our waterways, all while saving money and forming a tighter bond with the things we already have in our closet. S tier. One idea that might not get the attention it deserves is to use cold water to wash your clothes and air dry them when they're done. First of all, how much could a hot water wash warm the climate? On average, a load of laundry washed at 60 degrees Celsius and tossed in the dryer produces around 3.3 kilograms of CO2e. In contrast, a cold wash of room temperature water generates 0.6 kilograms of CO2e, and of course none from hang drying. The average person uses their washer and dryer about 167 times per year, meaning the average hot water user emits 552 kilograms of CO2e, while the cold water enjoyer emits only 100 kilograms of CO2e. This is a difference of 452 kilograms, and has the potential to go even higher if you pick up Magic the Gathering and only do one load of laundry a year. B tier. Now, I'm sure a lot of you in the environmental crowd have heard of vegan leather, a plant-based leather alternative that doesn't require skinning a cow. This has got to be good for the climate, right? Well, not really. The term vegan leather is a complete greenwashing scam to hide the fact that most of these products are made with petroleum. Even fancy vegan leathers made from pineapple pulp or cactus fibers are still chock full of plastics, meaning they are not biodegradable like standard leather and may even generate more CO2e. But hey, they're vegan, right? For a complete lack of climate relevance, plus just another avenue for big oil to manipulate consumers into buying their crap, vegan leather gets F tier. Now, to be fair, some companies like Biofabrica claim to have made vegan leather that produces 90% less CO2e, but it'll be a long time before this becomes mainstream. One of the most popular ideas to help the environment in the last century has been to get a reusable tote bag. But how relevant is this to climate change? Your standard LDPE takeout bag has a very small impact on global CO2 emissions, with around 0.1 kilograms of CO2e per bag. Eventually these will start to add up, so it does behoove you to get a reusable bag to not only stop single-use plastic emissions, but also keep these disgusting pieces of trash from ending up in our oceans. But how much CO2e do all these different tote bags produce? This polypropylene bag only costs 0.6 kilograms of CO2e to make, meaning you only have to use it about 6 times to break even. This recycled PET bag costs 0.75 kilograms of CO2e to make, meaning it pays for itself in about 8 uses. How about this pretty cotton one? Oh right, cotton is pretty carbon intensive to grow. Plus a full life cycle assessment means this bag will produce more CO2e once it's tossed out. Depending on the bag and the type of cotton, you might need to use this bag 53 to 150 times before it pays for its carbon cost. This is definitely within reason, but requires you to care for and consistently use your tote. Assuming you use a renewable bag 100 times a year, it would only keep about 10 kilograms of CO2e out of the air. Good for pollution, but kinda useless for climate change. I'm gonna have to give it D tier. Now, we all know that driving isn't good for the climate. Unfortunately, in some parts of the world, notably America, public transportation is about as robust as an uppercut from Mitch McConnell. However, if taking the bus is an option, how much does this help the climate compared to driving? Let's do some quick math. The average passenger vehicle in the US drives about 18,500 kilometers per year with a rate of 171 to 249 grams of CO2e per kilometer. This puts the yearly CO2e from one average car between 3.2 and 4.6 tons per year. Yikes. Taking the bus, on the other hand, emits only 1.8 tons per year. Even though it's a bigger vehicle and emits more CO2e, the emissions are shared between all the passengers, making your personal contribution far less than driving a car. If you replace 25% of the distance you drive with bus commuting, this could cut out 350 to 700 kilograms of CO2e per year. Taking the bus more lands squarely in B tier. The subway's even better. A passenger using the ridiculously efficient subway every day only produces 0.52 tons of CO2e per year. If 25% of your yearly driving was replaced by subway travel, this could mitigate 670 to 1,020 kilograms of CO2e from the air, putting subways in A tier. Now, of course, I couldn't forget to mention biking and walking. It is much more difficult to replace 25% of your yearly commuting with these options, but they are by far the most sustainable methods of transportation as they emit 0 grams of carbon dioxide. Granted, bike maintenance and walking shoes will emit a little, but not enough to be worth factoring in here. Replacing 25% of your driving with walking or biking could cut 800 to 1,150 kilograms of CO2e from our atmosphere, putting this option in A tier too. But what if I don't want to give up driving, I can hear you saying? Well, surprisingly, some people have proposed the idea of eco-driving, a method of city driving that is less aggressive and more fuel efficient, potentially cutting down carbon emissions. Now, this isn't just a bunch of eco-wimps whining about Dodge Rams tailgating their Prius on their way to Whole Foods. There's some real research that has gone into tracking the emissions of eco-driving. The idea is to use as little gas and as little braking as possible to maximize fuel efficiency. Basically, just go for the high score on your mileage. This means gradual accelerations, anticipating red and green lights ahead of you, coasting whenever possible, maintaining a steady speed, keeping tires properly inflated, using the AC less, and not carrying around extra weight in your car. A study found that drivers who focused on these eco-driving patterns emitted 30% less CO2e between the speeds of 10 and 40 kilometers per hour. Assuming 25% of your commute is city driving at these slower speeds, you could stand to mitigate 240 to 345 kilograms of CO2e per year just by eco-driving. Granted, this isn't a real solution to the issue of vehicle emissions, but it's still better than the alternative pedal-to-the-metal driving. C tier. Now there's one more driving alternative that has taken the world by storm recently, and that's driving an electric vehicle, or EV. But how much of a difference do EVs make? It's actually more than you would expect. It is true that to produce EVs, specifically the lithium-ion batteries for them, there is a higher carbon cost compared to regular combustion engine cars. But this extra carbon is mitigated within about 2 years of buying an EV instead of a gas-burning car. This also depends on the EV in question. Tesla high-performance batteries are nearly twice as carbon-intensive as those in an EV like a Nissan Leaf. So factoring in the cost of production, batteries, and the CO2e coming from the electricity needed to charge these cars, a Nissan Leaf will mitigate about 116 to 181 grams of CO2e per kilometer, depending on your electricity source. An average Tesla will mitigate 88 to 147 grams of CO2e per kilometer. This means that over a year, using our average driving distance from earlier, a Nissan Leaf can keep 2.1 to 3.4 tons of CO2e out of the air, while a Tesla can mitigate 1.6 to 2.7 tons of CO2e. These are absolutely incredible results. However, there are issues that need to be addressed. First, for EVs to truly shine, all our electricity needs to be carbon neutral. There's no point in charging your car with watts coming from a coal power plant. Also, the mining of lithium has sparked a water crisis in nations like Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia, where half the supply of lithium comes from. Also, Congolese cobalt extraction supporting 2/3 of global production and employing over 40,000 children in artisanal mines is also completely non-sustainable and a violation of human rights. Does this mean that EVs are a failed concept and we should just stick to driving regular cars? No, but in their current form, EVs are merely a transitional piece in the puzzle that is carbon neutral transportation. The emissions coming from combustion engines are arguably a worse net outcome for humanity than the harm done by the EV market. Still, the whole EV market reeks of imperialist resource extraction at the loss of indigenous communities and modern-day slavery. There's a lot more to unpack than we have time for, but the combination of ridiculous emissions reductions while also supporting a new extractivist market puts Tesla in B tier with standard electric vehicles in A tier. A tough decision for sure. While we're on the topic of transportation still, does flying less help the climate? So first of all, yes, the aviation industry, including passenger, freight, and military, produces around 2.5% of all global carbon emissions. But this doesn't cover the full scope. You see, airplanes are really good at making contrails, these wispy, high-altitude clouds of water vapor that conspiracy theorists are convinced will turn you into a liberal or something. It turns out contrails are really good at absorbing infrared radiation, meaning they heat up the planet alongside the carbon coming from jet fuel. This is a prime example of how CO2 does not equal CO2e, with the CO2e of the aviation industry being around 3.5% of global warming. But how much does cutting out a flight to Vegas help your carbon footprint? The average emissions from a passenger flight are around 126 grams of CO2e per kilometer. With an average round-trip flight distance of 2,756 kilometers, cutting out just one flight can keep about 347 kilograms of CO2e out of the air. But wait, there's more! If you fly first class or any sort of premium seating, your personal share of the total flight emissions goes up. This is because your seats make the flight less efficient with spacing, and therefore your personal contribution to the total share can rise by 2.6 to 4.3 times that of economy seating. This puts the CO2e of a first-class round-trip flight anywhere between 902 to 1,493 kilograms of CO2e. So yeah, cutting out just one unnecessary round-trip flight can cut up to 1.5 tons of CO2e off your personal contributions, making this an incredibly effective method for those who fly consistently. A tier. Alright, enough about moving around. What about the people who stay at home all day? How can these folks reduce their emissions? Well, one idea people have mentioned is switching to LED lights. If you have incandescent bulbs, 1, why? And 2, stop. These things are outdated, inefficient, fragile, and overall kinda suck. Compact fluorescent bulbs suck in a different way. They're full of toxic mercury and are a total health risk if they shatter. But LEDs, now we're talking. These things are near indestructible, comparatively non-toxic, and are 7 times more energy efficient than an incandescent. If the average US household consumes 1,700 kilowatt hours per year for lighting, and the average US emissions for energy is 0.39 kilograms of CO2e per kilowatt hour, then switching to all LED lighting could mitigate around 568 kilograms of CO2e per year. This will vary depending on how sustainable versus non-sustainable your personal energy grid is, but still quite a large chunk for a simple and cheap switch. LEDs get B tier. Lowering your thermostat in the winter and raising it in the summer is something I hear all the time. Now the effect of this is totally dependent on things like gas versus electric heating, insulation, electric grid, etc. Most review papers and studies have put the average CO2e mitigated per degree Celsius of thermostat change around 80 to 150 kilograms per year. Overall, a decent outcome just for pressing a button and maybe wearing an extra layer. C tier. Okay, a product I've been seeing a lot of recently is bamboo. Proprietors claim it's a sustainable material that helps fight climate change, but is that really the case? The bamboo industry as a whole is surprisingly making small steps towards this goal. Bamboo grows incredibly fast and can sequester carbon in the soil, even if being harvested, on the order of 6 to 13 tons per hectare per year. However, the main thing bamboo seems to be used for are things like toothbrushes, kitchen utensils, and maybe the occasional chair or table. These aren't really big impact items climate-wise, so unless you plan on building your next house out of bamboo, you might stand to offset 5 to 10 kilograms of CO2e per year. Sustainable, yes, but more about pollution than climate change. D tier. Now what about rooftop solar? Seems like everyone is getting them nowadays, but do they cost more CO2 to make than they save? Is this actually carbon neutral or just some Cali yuppie tech trend? Fortunately for us, they are one of the best options available for cutting your personal emissions. The average US household uses 10,791 kilowatt hours of electricity every year, with average emissions of 0.39 kilograms of CO2e per kilowatt hour. Making solar energy intrinsically produces no CO2e, but making the panels does. If we factor in the cost of making solar panels over the total lifespan, it comes out to between 40 to 50 grams of CO2e per kilowatt hour, about 10 times less than the average grid energy. If you live in a sunny part of the world and install enough rooftop solar to supply 100% of your energy, it can mitigate 3,777 kilograms of CO2e every year. This means solar panels typically cover the costs of their own emissions in 2 to 3 years, with decades of use still left on them. Insane results that also save hundreds on electricity bills? S tier, hands down. If you've made it this far into the video, I commend you. Hit that like and subscribe button if you haven't yet while we finish the last few ideas. Some people will argue that voting for climate change focused policies and politicians will make a big impact in future years. While this is technically true, a recent Gallup poll showed that 61% of Americans are concerned about climate change, and yet we're not seeing a rapid sustainable transition on par with scientific warnings about future outcomes. If public opinion mattered as much as it should, we would be on a very different trajectory than we are today. Unfortunately, it seems as though controllers of capital and interest groups dictate policy to a much greater extent than the combined force of all voters. A Cambridge study looked at how the average voter support, economic elite support, and interest group support affected the likelihood of policy being passed. The gray bars represent the percentage of the group that wants a certain policy, and the black line is the outcome across their 1,779 policies analyzed. Loving or hating the policy seems irrelevant to the average voter, with about 30% across the board. Now look at economic elites and interest groups. When they want something, they're actually more likely to get it. And that's kinda why we're still in this mess. The status quo bias of federal structure, along with the immense political clout the ultra-wealthy have, renders most national-scale voting pretty futile. By all means, still vote whenever possible, as state and local elections are not the same as federal. But also, if you really want to stir the political pot, attend a demonstration or protest, because voting ain't cutting it. D tier for fighting climate change. But how about them reusable bottles? Good for the climate or just for collecting stickers? Just like reusable bags, this is only good for the climate once it beats out the carbon from single-use plastic bottles. A typical plastic water bottle generates around 70 grams of CO2e per bottle. For a reusable plastic bottle to break even, it needs to be used about 10 to 20 times depending on your plastic of choice. If petrol products aren't your favorite, stainless steel bottles like Hydro Flasks pay for themselves after about 50 uses. And even the fanciest virgin aluminum water bottles will beat out plastic after 500 uses. And that's just in terms of emissions, not taking into account the fact that single-use bottles will sit in landfills or float in the ocean for centuries after you use them for an hour. So on average, your first month or two with a new reusable bottle goes to paying off its carbon debt, and then assuming one use per day, these bottles can keep around 25 kilograms of CO2e out of the air per year. Pretty tiny for climate change, but still impactful for reducing pollution. D tier. Finally, we get to our last idea, the debate as old as time itself that has had philosophers from Aristotle to Nietzsche scratching their heads. Which straw is better, paper or plastic? Well, straws produce so little CO2e per unit that the entire straw industry needs to be assessed to actually know what's best. A total life cycle assessment of plastic straws, bioplastic straws, and paper straws rank the three based on their total CO2e from production to disposal. It turns out bioplastic has the lowest CO2e, followed closely by polypropylene plastic. And then at about 5 times more CO2e we have paper straws. But what? I thought these were supposed to be good for the planet. Well, maybe in terms of pollution, but not in terms of warming. Also, paper straws are typically coated with PFAs, those pesky forever chemicals, which are always breaking off into your drink as your straw decomposes into a pulpy mess. Metal straws are an actual solution to this problem, or you could just drink straight from the cup. Crazy concept, I know. Paper straws get F tier for sure. And that is it, a complete tier list on how to cut down your personal carbon footprint. Just to reiterate, the whole concept of a carbon footprint was crafted in order to blame consumers for merely existing in an unsustainable economy. It is not any of our faults that the last 2 centuries were spent creating a world in which making a living meant consuming fossil fuels and destabilizing the climate. We cannot undo the mistakes of the past, but putting a little effort into changing our present habits can shift markets and supply chains towards a more sustainable future. Take it upon yourself to try out one of these ideas, only if you have the physical, mental, or financial means of doing so. The more of us there are shouting for a sustainable future, the louder our voices get. Thanks so much for sticking around to the end. I hope this video taught you as much about our personal emissions as it did for me while researching it. Let me know in the comments if you think I placed something in the wrong spot, or if you have a topic that I couldn't cover in this tier list. As always, all the sources are linked in the description. If you like this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to support Planet Zero. I'll see you next time.